exciting, they're dynamic and so on, but it's not just because of that. I think a really nice way to think about cities is that cities are essentially matchmakers. And those of you that are familiar with economic geography literature, regional economics literature, will know this terminology about labour pools, infrastructure, sharing and knowledge spillovers. So it's about the way that firms and households alike find it really useful to locate in cities. If you're a household, then you find that there's more choices for your labour that you're offering. If you're a firm, you find that you've got shared infrastructure. If you're looking for warehousing, cold storage, transport infrastructure, you find those predominantly in cities. You can see this is a map of Vietnam. On the left, you've got numbers of poor people, and this is in 1999, and this is in 2009. So you can see if you just looked at numbers of poor people, you see them clustered in cities. This is where Hanoi is at the top, and this is where Ho Chi Minh City is at the bottom. So if you just look at numbers of poor people, you might think, oh, cities are a magnet for poor people, and we've got a real poverty problem in cities. But what you notice over time between 1999 and 2009 is that the numbers of poor people in cities has greatly declined. And actually it's stayed relatively constant in the rural areas. If you also look at poverty rate, you can see it's actually much lower in the cities, and it got lower over time. So you can see the same two areas there. So you could say cities have been driving poverty reduction. So I don't know if I've made my case yet, but this is about what you would expect from cities. So for firms, agglomeration economies, you get market size, productivity, learning spillovers. So essentially cities are providing efficiency. And then for households, you can talk about access to opportunities, amenities and services. So this is about cities being kind of kind. We were told not to use clip art, but I can resist that. So, what does this mean for us? And by us, I mean, I guess, development practitioners, market systems professionals, and so on. So this is where I go on to what we actually found in our research work. So number one, this doesn't necessarily mean leaving markets to run themselves. So you have often found in the most successful cities around the world strategic interventions. Secondly, a growth coalition. So you often find that there are coordination failures in markets, and you have coordinated action that can solve that, whether it's through providing shared services, club goods, other kinds of coordinated action, lobbying and so on. And then you do need planning and implementation. So it's not just leaving things to their own devices, you need a concerted effort. So I know that people are going to kind of argue a lot, claim a lot of things over the next few days, but I'm going to present some of the evidence that we base this on. It's found in much more eloquent language in a report which is available on the internet. I'll leave the web address up there at the end. So we looked at data on 750 cities worldwide. It's a data set on the biggest 750 cities in the world. But I will try and kind of transpose this also to smaller cities. We did 6 case studies. So we did 1 in each region of the world, 1 in Africa, 1 in Latin America, 1 in Asia, and so on. We looked at secondary literature because there's a huge amount, and we did some firm level econometrics. And we had a lot of conversations about it. So, a few things to point out first. So number one, I think as we know, cities are where most GDP is located. So this is a map of GDP per kilometre that you might have seen before. South Korea at the top left, Japan at the top right, and the US. So you're going to notice a few things. One, as one of Sean's colleagues said to me, you can't spread economic development like butter across the economic landscape. It's always going to be lumpy, no matter how much you heat it up and so on. So it's always going to be lumpy, and those lumps will be in cities. Secondly, you might notice the lumps are of different sizes. So you get different heights of these peaks. So cities perform really differently. Some cities perform superbly, and we know about most of them. And some cities are less highly performing. So when we looked at what the data showed, and this is for jobs, GDP, and household income, we saw a huge variation in how well cities are performing around the world. So this is the minimum and the maximum annual growth in jobs, the minimum and the maximum annual growth in GDP, and the minimum and the maximum annual growth in household disposable income. So a huge variation even within cities, which shows that there's a lot of room for improvement. When we tried to quantify this, we found that if the average city, so your typical city, was performing at the level of the best 10% of cities, you would create about 19 million more jobs per year. So if we're thinking about scale, this is quite a good way to get scale if you're working in cities. I'm aware that I might be, that this is sort of a lot of information to present at once, so I wanted also to talk about a particular case that we looked at. So this case is in Turkey. It's in a city in eastern Turkey called Gaziantep, which many of you have probably heard of now because there's a huge number of refugees there, about 300,000 refugees or more from Syria. But it was also famous in Turkey before that because the carpets that you see on the floor in most conference centres or hotels, these people have managed to produce about 60% of all exported machine-made carpets in the world, which is pretty amazing. So when you look at this on paper, you wouldn't necessarily know that. I mean, it's close to the Syrian border. It's in a very dry landscape. It's not a port city. It has a relatively low-skilled population, and there are no high-tech clusters. So there's no sort of ICT, nanotechnology, biotech clusters. So if you were going there as a development practitioner or as a public policy maker, what would you do? Where would you start? Actually, I wanted to turn this over to the audience. Is that fine? I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer. What would you in particular, what would you start with?
What are the assets? What do they have there?
Right. Okay.
What do they have there? Tell us.
So they've got, they have a lot of pistachio nuts in the surrounding area, and they have a big trade route of carpets and shoes that's going through Gaziantep. So from Syria and Iraq and up towards Europe, and also goods coming the other way as well. Alison.
I'd get together a bunch of people who live and work there and are involved in making decisions, policy decisions, and involved in trying to do business. And I would facilitate some time with them, so create a space for them,
right,
to see what could come out of those engagements and those discussions. Because I would be very scared and very nervous of trying to jump into that context,
right,
and setting up a pistachio nut processing something or other. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. So the nice news is that most of us have the right answers because this is pretty much exactly what they did on both counts. So they started with what they had, which was this trade route, and they figured out with in sector associations they have a carpet association, footwear association, and so on. What could they do to really capitalise on this? So they managed to move. They were a kind of town of traders, and they managed to move into production somehow. So this was partly on the assets that they had. So if you go pretty much anywhere in Turkey, you find that the best possible baklava that you can buy is often from Gaziantep with pistachios. And I don't know where this particular carpet comes from, but it's almost likely that it has something to do with Gaziantep. So I'll go into a bit more detail about the who in a minute, but they certainly started with the assets that they have. So this is one of the carpet factories, which is, as you can see, it's on a pretty big scale. I mean, this is not like a livelihoods project. This is big business, and a lot of jobs created. So in 2003, this is one of the 5 industrial zones. So this is 2003. and this is only 11 years later. So you can see, I mean, these are not warehouses, these are all factories. And you can see, I mean, really dramatic changes in 11 years, which I think is what what most of us are looking for. So they export to 175 countries. I won't read this out completely, but I mean, exports is a big feature. Number 9 for economic growth in that particular decade and in the world, and average annual GDP growth of 6.3%. So they grew from about 4,500 GDP per capita to about 6,000 GDP per capita in a short number of years. So what patterns do we observe from that story? So number 1, it was not about hairdressers and kind of local professions. It was about tradable goods and services. It was about carpets, baklava, footwear, and so on. We looked at the data globally, and we found that in the top 10% of cities, the annual employment growth, it was really being driven by tradable goods and services. That's the orange bar chart here. And in the other 90% of cities, they're more or less neck and neck. So if you really want to be a high-performing city, this is where your bets might be. And that's for a couple of good reasons. So one, because you expand the local economic pie, because you're bringing more income. By tradable, we mean things like light manufacturing, agribusiness goods, tradable services, if it's in ICT, financial services, and so on. It's not going to be plumbers, carpenters, restaurants, hairdressers, things that you can definitely do better locally, and you can contribute to the tradable sectors, but it's not necessarily going to like structurally increase the size of your local economy. I mean, how many meals can you have in one day? There's only, all the population are only going to have 3 meals in one day, so you might get a bit more income if you have a better restaurant, but you're not going to end up massively growing the economy through that. If you look at this, so this is from Addis Ababa, it's another way to make the same point. It is not to say that tradables dominate the economy. So in Addis, there are only about 20% of all jobs, tradable goods and services. So this is industry and agriculture, about 20%. And the rest are consumer services, transport, public services, and so on. But they account for a much greater share of GDA, or GDP, or regional domestic product. So you can see industry and agriculture here, about 50% of GDP, but only 20% of jobs. So you won't necessarily find that this is a huge job created directly, but it's going to be a big job creator indirectly in all these other sectors as well. Secondly, how does this change at different levels of income? So across the top here, you've got the per capita income level of the city. This is using the 750 cities data. And you can see as you move up the income level, you first get a rise in manufactured goods, but only up to about 2,500 GDP per capita. After that, it's pretty flat, actually. So these cities are managing to get more income just by doing what they're already doing better. So if you take the Turkish example, for example, they're moving from basic, they're moving from agriculture and so on into baklava. And agribusiness, but then and some carpets, and then here they're going to get much better at doing more finely designed or whatever machine-made carpets. So they're going to increase their income level, but without moving into nanotechnology, which you only get up here. And then Sean was asking me to look at different sizes of cities. So what happens in smaller cities, in secondary cities? This is data from India, and it's color-coded by the size of the city. So I mean, this is pretty common sense, but at least this gives us some kind of data backup on what we think is true, which is that agriculture and forestry, mining, and so on is a bigger feature in smaller cities, but then in larger cities, it's all about ICT, high tech. I mean, so this is like, it's completely common sense, but we tried to just put an analytic face to this. In terms of size of city, you would often get a number of different value chains, a kind of diverse mix. And in small cities, they would tend to specialize. So if you're a practitioner, you might not be looking for a huge number of value chains in a smaller city. Even one can make a big difference when you're talking about tradable goods and services. Shall I speed up a bit? No, you're fine. Okay. So what did the cities actually do? How do they get this? And this is where we were coming to. So I don't want to add like yet another conceptual framework, because you guys already have that with the donuts and all the rest of it. But and a lot of it is overlapping. But we looked at institutions and regulations, infrastructure and land, skills and innovation, and enterprise support and finance. I think that the key thing that we wanted to underline was the way that these were really targeted to the needs of three different sources of firm level growth. So you've got the growth of existing firms, the attraction of new investors, and the creation of new startups. So it was all about having these different buckets of policy interventions, but making sure that they're very closely focused on solving a problem. So it wasn't just infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure, it was infrastructure that was going to be particularly suited to carpet manufacturing firms. The plot sizes were the right size, they were going to have the transport infrastructure they particularly needed to get to the port. You know, this kind of thing, it was quite strongly focused on what carpet firms needed. But secondly, across all the cities we looked at, there was no single ideal set, and that's kind of suggested by what I just said. We were interviewing here location advisory services firms and investment promotion agencies, and we found that, so we asked them, what do you find firms are asking for? What are they looking for? And we just tried to classify by the kind of firm that they were. So some investors are seeking lower costs, that's efficiency seeking. Some investors are seeking access to big markets. So if you go to Johannesburg or Lagos, that's your market access seeking. Some investors are seeking strategic assets. They care about the forest that's nearby, or the pistachio nuts, or and others are looking at resources, so mining and so on. And you can see that their needs, we're just trying to classify them. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but of course they vary. So this is again about making sure that whatever we do is geared to where the opportunities are. And within that, there are only a few that a city, policymakers in a city can actually influence, which might be city image, your responsive investment promotion agency, your institutional regulatory environment, your infrastructure availability of land, and sometimes fiscal incentives. As I alluded to, so some of these are industry specific and some of them are economy wide. So I work at the World Bank, where we have this ferocious and quite tedious debate about which one is better. So is it, Washington consensus and you just do your basic framework and everything else happens naturally, or do you have to pick winners or other heretical terms that people use? And people get very excited and cross with each other and upset and so on, but we were finding that cities did both. It doesn't need to be a dichotomy. You can make it easier for all kinds of business to set up, and you can also do something which is really going to help out your carpet firms which need a particular boost on whatever. So that's fine. Okay, so who does it? And this comes to Alison's point. Kind of industrial champions. And these were sort of highly respected individuals. There was the chairman of one of the big holding companies that was trying to push this forward. They were very fortunate on this side, I have to say, because he was so successful. He didn't. I mean, it was hard for him to be any more successful. It's one of the largest firms in Turkey, but he was integral to have like a leading individual to push things forward. They had lots of groups of local firms and also the two business chambers, Chamber of Trade and Chamber of Commerce. And then they have the municipality and then this city council that I mentioned with 300 delegates. There were loads of people involved. I mean, this was really like a model kind of public-private growth coalition, which we've written up into a case study and I think is fascinating myself. I'd never seen anything so sophisticated, but this seemed to be at the core of what they did. And if you talk to anyone else in Turkey about Gaziantep, they will say stuff like, oh yeah, it's amazing what these, they all talk with one mind. When they come here, they're all from different businesses, but they're lobbying for the same thing. There's something in the air, there's a culture of entrepreneurship, there's all these sort of mythical things about the city. But I thought it was rooted in this institutional structure, which means people are talking to each other. And I don't want to provoke Sean too much, but this is one of the fascinating things for me working in South Africa, where you often have a lot of people talking to each other, but somehow it just is not binding together, and people still working at cross purposes and doing, contradictory things. Okay, great. So I'm going to close actually in much less than 5 minutes. So who does it? This is like a very simple way of thinking about it. But these 4 things that I talked about: institutions and regulations, infrastructure and land, skills and innovation, enterprise support and finance. It's not about just getting everyone in a big room and deciding what's going to happen. Obviously you will need some kind of structuring of the debate and who's going to do what and so on. And you will often find, after you've thought about what the national government can do, tax reform and all the rest of it, what the city government can do, if it's about registering property and construction permits and so on, what the private sector can do, whether it's about, I don't know what they would do on the institutional and regulatory side, probably lobbying and sector associations and so on. There's often stuff that's left over, and that can be a key role for us sometimes. So either we work with these people to do what they're doing better, or we'll see kind of missing bits, and that can be a big role for us. And then lastly, so how to get it done? These are a few quotes from the people that we talked to along the way. So, and this is really at the city level. I don't know, I think this is sort of, this is beyond the market systems bit. It's not just one project, but if you're in a city, what are some of the kind of key failings that you often see when you're putting these kind of strategies into action? So one, that there's a big fractionalization of the effort across different line ministries. You wouldn't have a combined strategy. 2, that there's a huge wish list of what the city needs, and no one's actually gone through and prioritized it. So people are saying we need 2 to 3 focused areas rather than a wish list. This often happens when you're in a city, very complex, lots of different value chains, and there needs to be some prioritization. And lastly, management issues. So almost every city has a glossy strategy and a vision and so on, but very few have converted it into kind of systematic action. So that's about all the things that we're familiar with: tracking, performance management, accountability, midterm reviews, recognizing failure, adjusting and so on, and only a few cities are really doing this well. China is a really good example of this. And they have a structure which I don't have time to go into, but they call it leading groups, and these are people drawn from lots of ministries in a particular city or departments that meet together, and they have a very structured and regular process for assessing progress and then making mid-course corrections. It's in a way, it's not rocket science at all, but it's just that very few people actually do it. Everyone writes that they're going to do it, and then very few people do it. So last slide, what does this mean for us? I mentioned about strategic interventions. So these are some of the things that I said that cities were doing: institutions and regulations, infrastructure and land, skills and so on. I mentioned the growth coalition. So this was the champions, the firms, the municipality, the city council, the public-private coalition and so on. And I talked about planning and implementation, so not just leaving things to take their own course, that you have to take a very strategic look. So I think probably some of this is hidden in the donut guide and the other things that I've started reading. So again, I don't think much of this will be new, but it was striking that we found it when we looked at the evidence. So thinking about firms' needs in particular, when you're doing strategic interventions, start with the needs of firms. What's the competitive proposition? What markets are they selling to? Is it realistic for them to get into these particular products? Where are their competitors coming from? What's going to sustain their competitiveness? So really going to the firm level about their needs. creating a shared analysis and planning to engage with problems and opportunities. So this is part of the diagnostic and planning exercise. Secondly, structured dialogue. So not just about talking, but about having informed conversations. When the Carpet Association got together, they weren't ideologically sort of evangelical about where they could go with carpets, but they looked at where their competitors were. They tried to suck in firms from other cities in Turkey. They have, I think it's called, I can't remember the name, but they started a trade fair in carpets and so on. So it was sort of a structured approach. And then finally, planning and implementation. So the things that I just mentioned. So that's we've got a few background papers and the main report up there. Yeah, happy to answer any questions at the end. I think I've passed straight to Sean at this stage.
Sure. Right. So my journey, I thought I'll start by sharing my journey into local and regional economic development with you, because so I'm going to just assume that many of you come from a very hardcore private sector development perspective, you know, market development and all of the likes, and that you are following the same journey I followed on. My journey started about 15 or 16 years ago. I worked quite hard on private sector development, working with chambers of commerce, trying to figure out how we can make our city more competitive. And in doing this, became very involved with incubators, and I didn't even know there's a development field out there. So when I got a job offer to join the GTZ at that stage, I was really excited. I was going to actually work in a private sector development project. And about 2 weeks before I moved into my new office, my boss said to me, well, we've had a slight challenge with the bilateral negotiation, so the private sector development thing ain't going to happen. We're now a local economic development project with a strong emphasis on BDS and private sector development. So I was quite frightened to think that I would spend a lot of time with government officials, working in the private sector with business people. But anyways, what I learned when I went on this journey was that having a private sector development lens, I had a huge advantage over my colleagues who looked mainly at the urban space, the urban economics, the geography of it all. So I wanted to share some of this with you as you become more involved in regional development, in local development, and in city development. Cities are amazing places. If you want to see how in love people can be with cities, you have to read some of Jane Jacobs' old works and fall in love with the energy of cities, the dynamism in cities, the unpredictability in cities, the dual life that cities have. In the day they manufacture stuff, and at night they become social melting pots. You know, so cities are amazing places. And an interesting point is that cities are very important for social change in societies. It's where a lot of different ideas come together, and where people from different walks of life move through the same spaces, through the same things. And the last point there is that there's a lot of knowledge in cities that's unique, maybe in that manufacturing environment or in that retail environment. And this knowledge, we call it's sticky, because it's not always codified. It's actually sometimes unique to a place, and there could be a lot of advantage in it if you could figure out what is it that people in this place know that is unique. It's a very interesting thing to start looking at this stickiness of knowledge. So I love cities, but I want to just be careful now about the wording that I'm going to use. I'm going to use the word city and location interchangeably, because the same works for a large town in a rural area. There are some of the dynamics that are very similar. Okay, so how do I go? So when you look at these cities and you look at it from a value chain perspective, you very quickly realize that value chains, or sectors, or your markets actually connect cities in interesting ways. It connects cities with cities. It connects the rural landscape with cities. It connects regions of countries with regions of countries. It connects local with international. It's very interesting to look at value chains and how they very often connect different cities. So this is a very interesting phenomena. And people that are working mainly on urban development very often struggle to see this connectedness between this city and how it's linked into global value chains or into regional manufacturing. So there's a lot of interconnectedness in these cities. If you draw your value chain, you start saying, where are these people based? It's very interesting to look at this. But what's interesting about these places is that they very often have incomplete value chains. They don't have all the links of the value chain in a place. And in many cities, you have a wide range of diverse chains that are often all incomplete. So it's interesting to just observe this, that if you did a value chain analysis in a city, you might realize that they've got link 2 and link 3 and link 5.5, and some spaces in between. So it's interesting when you do value chain mapping in cities, you very often realize, but I don't have a value chain, I only have links. So that's just the interesting thing. The institutions in cities, and this is really from a perspective also of Africa, where we have huge challenges with things like decentralization. We have huge challenges that public institutions in cities are very often controlled from the national level, from the capital. It's easy to see also that capitals often have a hugely diverse and rich institutional landscape. I'm talking now of research centers, universities, and other kinds of institutions. So very often in these cities, we have these institutions that they are either controlled from somewhere else, they are too specific, so they don't even look at agri-processing research, they're only looking at some other nut, or, very narrow, or they are so generic that they don't matter. So I actually spend a lot of my time trying to find out how can we help these institutions to adjust to the local reality, and this is not so easy. What you find in cities, just again from a private sector development perspective, you find these things called clusters. I'm not going to go into the huge academic debate around clusters, but the interesting thing is that you find them in urban concentrations, where you have these diverse networks of different kinds of businesses that depend on each other, that coexist in a particular space. So private sector development combined with urban development very often focus on things like key clusters. I think your example in Turkey is probably a cluster example. There was a company and many suppliers and many kinds of service providers. What is important to complement these incomplete value chains is that the right kind of institutions need to emerge in these places. They need to be focused on reducing transaction costs. In cities, search cost is a very big expense. Actually finding the right service provider, the right supplier of a widget made of a particular kind of metal, it's very, very expensive. In agriculture, you often have fairs and physical places where people can show off their stuff. In cities, these are very often, it's very hard to find, these, and institutions play a critical role in connecting people across these different links. Right, am I going too fast?
You're going on.
Okay. So I find that what I find about business people is they have a very strange connection with places. I love to ask these questions. When I teach local economic development, I often make the government officials go and interview business people. And they always ask, what questionnaire should we use? And we only use 3 questions. And it's really great fun. You ask a business person, what is the effect of the place around you on your business? So what are you drawing from the space around you? So just, that's an outside-in arrow. If I was closer to that flip chart, I could draw it, but it's basically saying, what do you draw on from your environment? The second question is, what is the effect of your business on the environment? Just think about that for a moment. And then the third one, why is your business in this place and not in another city or in another town? The last one is really interesting, because a lot of businesses are in the places where they are because of family relations. They are in places where they are because they are caring for a weak grandmother that needs access to the hospital. There's very interesting reasons why businesses are in places. that if you looked at that same business person in a value chain, you would not pick that up. So there's a social dimension to this. If you play with this a little bit further, the second question, what is the effect of your business on the location? Again, if we interviewed this business as part of a market system study, we'd be looking mainly at relations with suppliers and with customers and so on. But what is interesting on that second question is you often realize that big businesses provide important scale into industrial districts with regards to the movement of employees. Bigger businesses make it possible for buses to run at the changes of shifts that small businesses benefit from. So there's very interesting things that a business, if you map the value chain, you would not realize the importance of this business and how it makes the location work, the systems in the location work. So another effect of businesses on locations is that a small automotive company in a city, just making some other component, is connected to a global knowledge base of how to manufacture metal goods, how to meet certain standards. So you find that these companies are linked in a value chain, that looks very nice, neat and tidy, but they actually connect these locations with international standards and international marketplaces. There's been some really interesting work on the role of these medium-sized businesses and how they actually make them contribute to knowledge flows in regions. So very simple 3 questions, but if you start playing with it, you could really reach some interesting conclusions. So I just want to spend 1 minute on the cluster and the value chain perspective, because I work with practitioners in both of these, and they tend to be a little bit tribal. So with this slide, I want to just try and show that you actually have a lot in common. So those of you that know clusters know that this cluster coordination is extremely important. This cluster identity is extremely important. And so what both of these tribes, if I can say that, have in common is that they are typically focused on the interaction between businesses. I think M4P's got the same. They becoming more and more sensitive of specialists. We have that in value chains. We find specialized transport providers and so forth. And there's a lot of focus on this ongoing process of learning and doing business with each other and adapting the process, okay? So in a cluster perspective, there's a very strong focus on locations. Even if Michael Porter's first use of the word is focused on national economies, it's a concept that's been around for a long time, and it's typically identified strongly with places. Clusters emerge out of places because of that knowledge that is sticky in a place. So when you look at a cluster perspective, and you look at urban spaces, you very often have a territorial, a place-based strategy to strengthen the place. I think, Austin, you mentioned last night the medical device, or was it you? The medical device market that would start developing in a place out of, what was it? Okay. So very often when you take a cluster approach, you actually have a unique approach also in terms of a territorial approach. There's some benefits to that, but there's also some downsides to that. An example would be the tourism cluster that you find in Cape Town. Brilliant for tourists. Terrible if you're trying to run a manufacturer there. Because you firstly have a very well organized lobbying group that will fight anything that makes sound, smoke, or that's ugly. And you also have parts of the year where nobody can visit you because flights in and hotels are so extremely expensive. So if you think about London and the financial, the very strong cluster that's emerged around finance, it makes it very hard to run a small business doing something when you have to pay that kind of rent and those kind of things. So strong clusters are great, but strong clusters also sometimes have these unintended consequences. Value chains very often focus on a functional perspective, where you look at these links in the chain, what people are doing. So we have far more focus on helping this link to become competitive and this link to upgrade the technology that they are using. And very often when we have a value chain approach, we have a more functional focus on our action plans. We're far more focused on achieving very specific things. And now the controversial part, I'm almost nervous to press this button, is that value chain perspective has a very strong market orientation. It's got a very strong orientation to what customers want and hopefully working a little bit back into the value chain. While the cluster perspective very often have a very strong supply-driven perspective. We work with what we have, we recognize the assets that we have, and we try to do our very best with them. Now, many cities are caught between these two, and that's why I think M4P and private sector development people bring a capability of moving between those two modes. We can shift between those and we can help people in locations make sense of what is it that the private sector is stuck with and what can we do to help them grow? What obstacles can we try to remove, and how can we get these people to work together better? It's immaterial really whether you start with a value chain or cluster approach. You have to figure out who is there, and for me a very important question, I think Austin alluded to that, is who is willing to work with local government is also a very important question. Right, so a key element of developing cities is, if you come from a private sector development perspective particularly, you have to realize that core to what you're trying to do, you're trying to strengthen the locational advantage. You want to try and strengthen the advantage that companies have for being in this region. You want to strengthen the attractiveness of this area, unfortunately, in relation to other areas. So there's a little bit of competition often between cities to attract investors and so on. But when you look at location, there are three things that you have to consider. The most important thing that people think of always is the tangible stuff, you know, the hard infrastructure, the physical things. And from a private sector development perspective, we know these things are important. Very often in cities, people are a bit stuck on that because they're having trouble trying to decide what to do next and where to invest. So when you're looking at a value chain perspective, we can help cities figure out what infrastructure do you need to strengthen and how. So we can contribute a little bit to some of the challenges at that level. But there are two intangible things that we have to consider that for private sector development practitioners sometimes a little bit odd, not natural. There are those intangible factors that are important for enterprises. It links to that thing I asked just now about why are you here and not there? Businesses locate in places because of access to schools, access to skilled staff, but they also locate to places for intangible things like efficient local government, the climate, the vibe in the place. So, you know, while some people would say we're in the city because of transport routes, they would also say, well, we're in the city because the people here can change fast, the people here learn fast, there's good other infrastructure in the environment. The other intangible thing that we have to consider, and this was for me the most difficult to think about, is that in cities we also have to think about intangible factors that are relevant for individuals. This is things like, what will your children do on a weekend? Access to movies, social infrastructure, and actually a lot of innovation is driven from, in cities, is driven through social interaction. People that you have nothing in common with, maybe except a child, that you meet in the parking lot at the school. Ideas spill over between industries, between value chains, very often through social architecture, through social events, like going to a ballet. I've got two daughters, so I'm a regular now at ballet concerts, and I've met the most amazing people there doing the strangest things. And one or two of them have actually paid me to do things for them. So, you know, if you'd map that on a value chain, we would never find each other because our two chains don't have anything in common. Mm-hmm. So it's important that when you take a private sector development perspective, it's not as neat as your sector map, and it's not as tidy as I almost said your donut, but as your value chain map. There's a lot of stuff happening between these systems that you have to become sensitive to. Right, he says I've got 5. So let's say you have to now start working in a city. And let's just hope and pray that there's somebody there that is also maybe employed by the public sector, but they are really keen to strengthen the local economy. So let's say there's a regional development agency of some sort. So one of the challenges of any of these stakeholders, but of regional development agencies in cities, is they have all of these demands coming from people that want support. How do they figure out who's actually got market potential? How do they figure out who will contribute to the dynamism, is that a word, and the energy of the place? So we've developed this very simple little matrix just to help people figure out where to start. And it's a little 2x2 matrix. I hate using these, but just in this example, I think it brings a point across. Just imagine this matrix. On the y-axis, we've got strong physical and social infrastructure, which means we've got good institutions and maybe appropriate infrastructure. And on the other end, we have weak physical and institutional infrastructure. So maybe it was relevant at one stage, but for what's going on in the economy now, maybe it's not so suitable anymore. And on the x-axis, we have that there are lead sectors that are growing, the visible dominant sectors are growing, and on the other side, the lead sectors are declining. So my idea was to do a quick exercise with you to just say, what do you find in that top right quadrant, where the lead sectors are growing and the institutions and the infrastructure is strong? What is the mood there in that area like? Come quickly, he's telling me I must go fast.
Optimistic.
Optimistic. Okay, what else? What is the mood like? Positive.
Like in Turkish city.
Okay. Okay, so maybe there's a lot of things happening. What else? One more. Time's up. Okay. These places we call dynamic. Actually, it's very interesting from a market systems development perspective. In these dynamic regions, you also have a lot of market failures. It's so busy that you actually don't know where to start and where to find stuff. But typically in those regions have very dynamic regions with a lot of things happening. So in a city, you typically find these dynamic regions where a lot is happening. Where you have lead sectors that are growing, but you have the wrong infrastructure. You often have a lot of pain. The private sector is 2 or 3 steps ahead of the public sector, and they are complaining every step of the way. They're complaining about electricity, about roads, about mobility of staff, and so forth. M4P projects and PSD people can play a critical role here in trying to figure out what's next, what is required, but very often in moderating or facilitating this process of discussion. Because for the public sector, it's very frustrating because they don't know whether they're being taken for a ride by these companies or whether there's really something that is driving this change. In that area there, on the bottom left, where you have sectors that are declining, your leading sectors are declining, and you have the wrong infrastructure, you have areas that are marginalized. And in an urban development context, you have to worry about these places. Because now the way cities are growing across Africa, the marginalized regions are becoming more marginalized. It's a big headache. And there's a lot of market failures there. And this is a really tough place, because this is where you have amazing infrastructure, but the business is going away.
Europe.
Europe. He said that. I was thinking like mining towns, but okay. So the interesting thing is that when you do this, it helps you to say, well, what is our program good at? Can the kind of industries that we are good at working with help to strengthen declining areas? Can the kind of market information that we have help to figure out how to build appropriate institutions and strengthen infrastructure? Market programs because you can connect this place with other places, you bring a very particular, very special view to the location. And when you're just in the place, if you're just looking at the place, you are stuck doing that tango between these 4 blocks very often. But then the declining region, of course, you must always watch out for the delusional that's thinking that the gold mines will come back, or that they will discover coal, and that you could actually, grow this thing out of a hole. Okay, so M4Ps, programs. You can help strengthen the right institutions. You can help strengthen the right infrastructure. You can help strengthen the ongoing process of discovery and dialogue. Dialogue is very important in cities. I think Austin also alluded to that. And for public sector officials, it's very hard to have dialogue with the private sector. Because in Africa, our private sector is not even organized. I mean, never mind getting the public sector and the private sector to talk. There's a lot of fragmentation that is needed. And I want to end, the last point is about these locational factors. You have to here not just think about the efficiency in the value chain, but the connectedness between the firms and the place. You have to think about how can we strengthen the location and not just how can we help the enterprise. So that relationship between the businesses and the chain is important. Okay, I think just I've already covered a lot of these, your strengths when you come from a private sector development. I want to highlight the fourth bullet. The ability to move between different stakeholders, the ability to switch between sectors, working with institutions today and with the public sector tomorrow and with the private sector the day after. This is incredibly important and very unique to the PSD grouping. But what you must remember, what you must always have in the back of your head is it's not just about the chain. There's an interconnectedness between enterprises and places. So it's about understanding the enterprises and the place, the relationship, the interconnectedness between these. Right at the bottom, Lucha was very unhappy that I had a bullet with 3 lines in it. But what I just also...
Not only the lines, the terms.
The terms, okay, yes. So I drew it there as a triangle. I don't think there will be a chance to show that. But what we have to understand is that locations, and now this is the collective of the people in this place, in a city, they have to balance 3 competing demands. The first demand is this market orientation, where we want them to be fast. And cities especially have a challenge to respond fast to everybody. The second corner of the next, the bottom part of the triangle is that cities have to do a lot of integrated planning. If you just think about it, pipes, gas, roads, housing, there's a lot of stuff and they need to be integrated. So when you come to them with your brilliant plan, they might say to you, this is amazing, but can we do that next year or the year after? Because in cities you have a lot of coordination, also of the public sector. And the third corner of the triangle is community development, social development, where cities have to worry about people unemployed and social infrastructure, civil infrastructure like tennis courts. Us value chain people, we don't really value tennis courts that much and parks and these things, but it's very important in an urban context. So what my reminder to you in this regard is to understand that they have these 3 tensions and that we have to be creative in connecting these things. Like connecting a market opportunity with a community opportunity. Connecting a community opportunity with a planning opportunity. Our communities are often left out of planning. Connecting planning with building competitive local markets. So I think I'm going to skip the conclusion. And I had this interesting thing on the template that I would just want to say. What is just funny that I find often is that when you start with markets and a private sector development approach or a sector-based approach, you often end up in regions, even if you don't know it. When you start in regions, you very often end up in sectors and value chains. So it's just an interesting observation that there's this 2-step process. We call it a polarity. But what you have to do as a practitioner is, it's not about the one or the other. You have to understand the strengths of these 2 approaches, and you have to try and tap into the synergies. Because I think private sector development's got a huge contribution to make to making cities healthy, resilient, dynamic, and exciting. So I thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Sean. I'd like to open up for questions.
I would like to come back to what is described in the agenda of the presentations. And I mean, first of all, thanks for the presentation. Very, very comprehensive and full. But there is one question here which I would like to hear a bit more, probably from Sean Cunningham. It says here that is citizens' participation really important? I think both of you didn't really touch that issue, considering that there's lots of people living in these cities, and you partially touched issues. These people have other issues than only the economic development. So how do we engage also with the citizens? Then relating back to the example of China, where maybe citizen participation is not one of the strengths. So if you could say a few words on that, would be interesting.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bloom from DFID Tanzania. We're just starting, or about to start, an urban jobs programme in Dar, so this is really interesting for me. And I'm pleased that you say it's the start of a conversation. This has been a sobering session for me, because we're in the bottom half of the 4 quadrants, and in terms of the map that that Austin put up about urban infrastructure and how spread out we are. Tanzania, Dar es Salaam suffers from poor infrastructure, power issues, low population density, which is sort of spread out over a very big area. We have very poor institutional capacity. We have city management divided between 3 municipalities. I mean, they're just got low skills base. It's a veritable nest of wasp nest. Anyway, going forward, what would be really helpful for me from this session would be to find out from the panel, but also other people in the room, about urban jobs programs and what you've learned from them, and if we could even just list a few in this room and give a few seconds on each, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, Simon Stevens, also from DFID, not coordinated my question with Sarah, but it was kind of related. I'd be very interested to hear, well, I was very interested in the end of your presentation, Sean, the importance of the kind of overall city environment, because it's an area we're getting increasingly into. And I guess I'd like to hear from both of you in terms of experience of successful cities and your talk about the kind of things you need. As to, as a donor, for example, there are suggestions that we should be looking at urban planning. My thought is there's probably lots of urban planning out there, but probably what we need to look at is implementation. But where would you start really? Where would you start working with city? Would you Dar or somewhere else? Where would you start trying to make city as a space more effective for economic development?
My question would be, how much should we engage marginalized people, poor people, directly, when you're trying to think about development of cities?
I think I'm very biased towards participation. I think this is critical. And I must say that very often in a lot of urban economic development programs, there's a very, very strong top-down notion, and there's a place for that. But I'm very strongly biased towards a process of engaging and seeing economic development in cities as an ongoing process. It's not just about the next integrated development plan or budget cycle, but it's an ongoing process of getting people engaged. This is central, this process of dialogue. And in cities you have this thing that, because then the next question would be also for Sarah, where do you start? I mean, dialogue sounds nice, but I mean, the city hall is only so big. So where do you start? And I'm a bit of a maverick on that thing. I do not typically start in the dominant sectors, because very often there's been a lot being done already in the dominant sectors. So I like to try and figure out what is emerging, what is new in these places. So, but this is because I'm a process facilitator. I like the process of dialogue and drawing people in. So you have to start off by finding out what's been done in the past, what efforts to engage with the private sector has been successful, and what has not been successful, because that will definitely influence whatever you are doing. If there's been many attempts in the past to get the private sector and the public sector to talk together, and all of them ended on empty promises, then you have to be creative. So I think that's on the participation side. There are some things that you can only do in top-down ways, in a very strong top-down planning. For instance, industries would often, up to the very last minute, deny that they're in a crisis. that's their own making. They would blame market forces, the Chinese and everybody else, before they would actually say, but maybe we've underinvested in developing our internal management capability. Maybe we've underinvested in internal capacity. So there are some things that you would do in a participatory approach where you engage with the industries, but I think that it's very important, maybe as I grew up I realized it's very important to also look at the data and to try and understand why are certain industries in decline. But what you can't find in the data is what is emerging. This is really hard to find in the data. What are new economic activities that might need support and that needs a little bit of love and attention? It's very hard to find that in the data. So I don't know if...
So Sean, how do you do it in practice? When you try to do this thing,
Yeah.
what's your first, when you wake up in the morning, what's the first thing you do then?
Without too much detail.
Yeah, without too much
Well, what I've done in places, and I'll use the personal, what I've done in places is that what I've done in Ho Chi Minh City was a World Cafe with almost 1,000 people. I mean, the scale in Asia is just amazing. To try and figure out what's been done in the past. I used the questions from appreciative inquiry. What's been done in the past? What worked better than we expected? What did not work so well? And what do we really have to get right? People loved that. So I've used that in many different places. The question then is, who do you invite to those workshops? Mm-hmm. And very often you start off with a visible private sector organizations. But just understand also that public officials are sometimes very wary of these organizations because they very often lobby strongly for things. So I don't think it's rocket science. The point is that while you focus on the very visible sectors and the very articulated sectors, you have to also worry about who's not getting a chance to talk and who's not coming to our activities. I found that in cities, a sector approach is sometimes troublesome because a lot of people that is in our value chain don't know it. You know, we put them in the value chain that they're part of the automotive system. They think of themselves as a general engineer. We put them in the engineering sector. They think of themselves as specialists in metallurgy and metal hardening. So the sectors can also become traps. So I focus a bit on sectors, but very often I would focus on industrial areas, business districts. You have to try a multitude of things in a city to try and figure out what is the mood of the private sector, where are they willing to contribute, what are their conditions of participation. Can I answer the one about the poor?
Yes, sure.
So when you're trying to kickstart economic development in a city, so you're at the beginning, and this is the same for a town, you typically have to start with who is working and what is, the people that are already running. That's the easiest place to start. But you have to at some point get involved with better information to communities. And communities used now in the big sense of the word. In cities, you very often have that the unemployed in the city could be there unemployed, but they were previously employed in the rural countryside. So you mustn't assume that the unemployed in cities don't have skills. Very often people would choose to be unemployed in a city before being employed in another area. So understanding a little bit what kind of skills do people have, what capabilities they have, is very important. And there are ways of connecting social development activities, like helping people to use their skills with business development activities. I don't want to go into too much detail, but very often you find in cities, maybe a last point, that activities that's around social development is completely removed from economic development activities. So that's one of the challenges that you have. And an M4P project actually straddles those two. So that's one of the challenges that we often have, that the social development people do not have a market orientation mindset. And the business development people have very little skills on how to work at grassroots level with poor people. Okay.
So I wanted to let me just say a few things, but I think that none of us know all the answers here, right? Including the people at the front of the room. So maybe turn a couple of the questions back. to the rest of the room, but just on those 3 questions, so citizen participation, urban jobs programs, and where to start. Let me start with the 3rd question. I mean, I think so. The example that was given, right, urban planning and implementation. I think that in my experience, at least, a lot of my colleagues are very highly skilled experts who think that their particular hammer is going to be the silver bullet in the city. You know, whether it's urban planning, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's skills, you know, whatever it is. So some of them are preconditions for anyone to grow, like maybe urban planning is a good example. It's very hard unless you have that kind of precondition. But other ones, you really need a diagnostic. So whether it's, you know, starting with what firms are already doing, you know, Porter's Diamond kind of approach, 5 forces, whatever it turns out to be, but really understanding what is the competitiveness proposition. I wanted to share a story that one of my colleagues worked on in the UK, actually, in Hull, which is a fishing port on the North Sea. And they were experiencing again, amazing infrastructure and decline. So they were experiencing a huge decline in fishing revenues. And this colleague, who was a consultant, came in and thought, okay, so I'll start by talking to the industry, because they must know what they want to do. So the industry said, yeah, we've got it all sorted. We need warehousing, we need a cold chain, we need to upgrade the port to let bigger boats in, and you know, and this is really going to help us turn around our fish industry. Okay, great. So then he started delving a bit deeper. So it wasn't just consultation; it was structured consultation. So he was thinking, well, what's actually going to happen? So you've got warehousing, and you've got cold storage, and bigger boats are coming in, which includes your Chinese competitors who are bringing in their frozen fish. And you're actually going to facilitate, your industry is going to get even more wiped out by Chinese competitors. So you're facilitating all of them coming in with more frozen fish, putting in the cold chain, warehousing with their big boats and all the rest of it. Maybe let's think about fresh fish, because that's something where Chinese boats cannot compete. They're not going to bring fresh tilapia from China. So it was a totally different kind of infrastructure that was required. And to put it together, they went to Rotterdam and they saw the fresh flower industry and the robotics that go across, and they know exactly which consignment from Kenya is coming overnight and where it's going out to. So it turned out it wasn't at all about what the industry said it should be about. It was about logistics and becoming a fish logistics centre for the UK. So they've had some problems since then, but it was a real change of mindset. So what I think what this story tells me is number one, sometimes people have completely the wrong idea of the market in the first place, and that's even the firms themselves. So sometimes they don't know best, and it's not just about participation and consultation and so on. We need like a kind of analytic lens on this. Secondly, the question about urban jobs programs. I mean, I would feel more comfortable with talking about an urban industry program, and then the jobs flow from that. So, I mean, you won't always start with what's going to create the most jobs, but any job needs to be underpinned by the competitive proposition in the industry. So I would start with the industry and then have the jobs flowing from that. So this is super simplistic, but and then citizen participation. Yeah, I mean, so frankly, I think it's hard enough to get firm level growth in the first place. But at least if you're talking to firms, they would know where the sources of growth are going to come from. So I know this is like not the right politically correct thing to say, but I wouldn't necessarily see citizens as being your prime stakeholders in this. I would see firms as being the main stakeholders. They're the ones that are going to generate growth. So I think this is probably not what you wanted to hear, but I think it's such a complex problem to solve. You have to focus on your best bets, which are going to be from a firm level. But I don't know if the 3 questions provoke some thoughts in the audience as well.
To follow on, you were talking about public-private dialogue and the idea of engaging within the social aspects of the city. I wanted to kind of just bring up the idea of engaging with more traditional institutions within cities as well. So, as an example, I work on the Enable 2 program, which is focused on encouraging public-private dialogue in Northern Nigeria, business environment reform. And one area that we've started to look at a lot more is engaging with, for instance, faith-based organisations in engaging within business environment reform. And you find that they have that access to marginalised communities, but they also have a very active interest in terms of improving the business environment as well. So, for instance, working with institutions like the Council of Ulama, working with someone like Emir Khan, who's got a major kind of influence within a city and within a state as well, is an area where you can find opportunities to start building these linkages as well. So we want to see other examples people might have of that.
Thanks. Just a couple of thanks. Great presentations, guys. A couple of reflections. The research you presented, Austin, does its job as research, which points out fact. The problem with that fact is it's interpreted as a plan of action for development agencies, and that's what we do. You mentioned doing business earlier. Look at that as a corollary. We go and look at what institutions are common across countries which are competitive, and we say these are common things. So let's go and implant those somewhere, drop them in somewhere, and assume that that will drive competitiveness in these areas. And my concern with your research is how people interpret it, which is cities that are growing, doing well. There's certain characteristics that they have, and we aggregate those so they're generalizable across all the cities. And then we say, right, so in the areas in Dar es Salaam, we must have a dialogue platform, we must have a skills training program, we must have a... whereas really what's driven that is the journeys that they've got to those institutional qualities are all very, very, very different. There is not a plan, but there's a lot of series of individual plans. So Austin, whilst you said you didn't know much about M4P, you ended with 3 major headings, which is good diagnostics, what we need to know. Vision, but not a single vision, because there isn't a single vision. There's lots of systemic constraints. There's lots of small visions and lots of small decisions that somehow go in the right direction. And then you need to implement in accordance with those visions. So you unbeknowingly talked about diagnostics, vision, and consistent intervention with that. The other bit on citizen participation, I think we need to think of a bit more in a slightly different way. So if you're looking at, for example, building transport links, so in Lagos, for example, on the Enable program, you have to understand where potential workers are and where they're living. So spatial mapping to understand where people are coming and where they're going to be aggregating and what kind of transport and where and how do we put it in, at what cost or what price. You have to look at that. Skills development, companies that are growing need to access skills. So you need to start working with them to understand how they can build the institutions that can job match much more effectively. This homogenous group of poor are not homogenous at all. They need institutions that can separate and signpost skills more quickly. This I would class as citizen participation. It's about the way in which we participate with them, understanding where they are, understanding their needs. So I would take a broader view of citizen participation. It's not about asking them what they need necessarily, but they need to be participating in the process if it's to be working. Whether transport links are going to work, whether the kind of jobs that are created are jobs that these people can get, given the skills that they have. And once they've got the jobs and skills, what do they do with the money and stuff that they earn? Where do they move to within a city? What aspirations do they have? What schools do they send people to? What healthcare needs do they have? All the multiplier effects, if you like, of the impact of citizens. So I would personally take a broader view of what citizen participation means, which might be helpful for you, Austin, so you don't become politically incorrect next time.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, mine's more a question of scale and size. It's a really nice...
Could you make it really short?
Yeah, very short. It's a very, very nice approach. I'm thinking, how does this kind of approach apply to large towns or tiny cities? And I mean, you mentioned that you've been working with GTZ in the past and secondary centre development and all that kind of thing. Where would this apply in that sort of that level?
On the research side, I guess one thing I just wanted to emphasise is that, so I'm a real sceptic of what you can get from regressions and econometrics and so on, just for that reason that was pointed out. So we put a huge emphasis on case studies, which was about tracking how things happened over time. So what I pointed out was some of the patterns that we saw, and I have to say, public-private dialogue, for example, or joint visioning or whatever it was a big feature. So that's why I dwelt on it, but we definitely didn't pick that up in our numerical analysis. Very hard to pick that up in data. So that was why I put such emphasis on those. So it's really what came from the case studies, not just from the real regressions. On the rest of it, I don't have so much to add, actually. So maybe Sean does.
When I talk about institutions, I mean institutions that are important in this city. They're local institutions. They include universities, schools, churches are important, and there's a whole variety of others, because there are also institutions like the ballet theatre and those kind of things that very often business people forget about, and so these are important. And David, thank you for your comments. I like the way you explained citizen participation, because what often happens is that people confuse the target group with the beneficiaries. And this is very important in urban economic development, is that when you mustn't confuse the target groups and the beneficiaries. We're talking to the business people because we want to try and figure out how to create jobs. We're talking to the business people to figure out how to create jobs. I'm a bit concerned about how on earth you would do it at a big scale in interviewing the unemployed to find out where you can work. But then, Steve, thank you for your comment. The question always when you work with cities, and let's just assume that they've not had a purposeful economic development strategy. The question is always, where do you start? That is a big challenge, whether it's a small town or a big place. Our approach as MISO partner is, I mean, we're known as the quick win people. You start small, you start with a few, you start building trust between the private sector and the public sector, because you can use that as an example when you go to the next group and say, look what cooperation there has resulted in. Let's try the same thing here. So in secondary cities and in towns, you have to start off. I like to start off with who is innovating here. I'm very biased towards who's trying new things and how can we help them. Because very often the guys that are doing the old things for a long time are already so entrenched in their thinking that they think that we need to widen the harbour and change things. So that is, you can say more about that afterwards. We have a wealth of information and publications and papers available. So I don't even know, how to share that with you, but it's available on our website. And there was a particular...
We'll create talking about how to create, for example, a web page in the Beam Exchange that will bring all of this information together and references and documents. So we'll figure something out.
And last year we wrote a paper on metropolitan regions and innovation systems, so how to stimulate innovation systems in metropolitan regions, and that is also available. It was also GIZ.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much for sticking with time. We'll run out of it. I'm not going to say what I had planned to say to wrap up some of the ideas that I like the most. What I would like to say is thank you for making our lives even more complicated. Because there are many more things I think we need to take into account when we try to understand market systems in the context of cities and territory and places. But I think if we keep the conversation going and we start digging deeper and unpacking some of these things and turn them into ways of working, ways of analyzing market chains, market systems, ways of engaging different stakeholders, looking at individuals' interests, not just commercial interests, but life interest, education for their children, etc. I think it will make our work even more effective and more powerful. So please, let's continue the conversation. Don't forget to put your names in those lists. And before I give the word to Carrie, I would like to thank you all for being here today. It's been a great session. Thanks for your questions. And a big round of applause for them, please.